Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Green, the CEO and co-founder of Chalkbeat, and I will be moderating our discussion tonight. We are excited to be able to host this Votebeat event about the role of information in the war on misinformation, especially amid an assault on truth that is fixated on elections. For those who don't know, Votebeat is a pop-up newsroom that offered focused local coverage of voting and election administration starting in October of 2020 and running through the inauguration. Votebeat is a project of Chalkbeat. We've now decided to push to continue the project through the 2022 midterms for reasons that I hope will become very clear tonight. We'll be talking tonight with three incredible local journalists who participated in Votebeat's launch during the run-up and aftermath of the 2020 election. They'll share about the stories they covered, the differences those stories made, and they'll also talk about what comes next. But first, we have two panelists to get us started with an eye on the national picture. So let me welcome them right now. Hi. Hi, it's great to see you guys. Thank you so much for being here. Let me introduce you two first and then we'll jump in. Today, we are very fortunate to have Alexandria Neason, who goes by Alex. Alex is a staff writer at Columbia Journalism Review. And previously, she was a reporter at The Village Voice and covered education for the Teacher Project, which was a partnership between the Columbia Journalism School and Slate, and a project I read closely as I do her coverage in CJR. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Alex.
So happy to be here.
And we also joining us have Mindy Moretti. Hi, Mindy.
Hi.
Mindy is a writer and editor for Electionline.org, which is the nation's only nonpartisan, non-advocacy clearinghouse for election administration news and information. She previously was a senior writer for County News, a publication of the National Association of Counties. Thank you so much for being here, Mindy, and thank you, Alex. So, Mindy, I'd like to start with you. We asked you to join us because your job since, I believe, 2005 has included reading every single story written every day in America about election news and then compiling them for the people who watch elections most closely. So I'd love for you to get us started. What are the biggest stories today in election coverage?
So for right now, it's legislation. Last year, it was lawsuits. This year, it's legislation. It's incredible the amount of legislation that's come out this year. I mean, I think we all were anticipating it, but it's still just like every week. I mean, when I sort of round the, I post them every day, and then on our newsletter, I sort of do a bit of a summary of all of them, thanks to the work of the journalists who will be on later. And it's unbelievable. I mean, how much there is. I'm like, I can't summarize one more piece of legislation because there is so much of it. So I think that'll continue on. Although, the legislatures have such odd sessions. So it won't be a whole year thing because I think a lot of them finish up by early summer.
And as so many of us have seen from the headlines, at the center of this legislation really is a push for more restrictive voting policies.
Absolutely. I mean, even in places like Montana, where they've been voting by mail for quite a while, and they all love it. I mean, they really do. There's been a push to scale that back there. And I mean, even, Arizona is another perfect example where people have been largely voting by mail there for years. And now all of a sudden there's all this legislation to change that process. And it's not because it's founded remotely, but because it's being pushed by the quote unquote big lie.
And so, I mean, that kind of gets into my next question, which is you've decided to dedicate your energies as somebody who's passionate about the integrity of elections to media about the election. Why does media coverage matter in this march of policy and the work of administering elections?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's changed so much since 2005. I mean, there weren't that many reporters covering it. They would come around on an election year, and even now it dips off. It definitely dips off. But it's just so important. There's so much more media than what there used to be, and it's just the whole tenor of it has changed. And I think it's so important for the media to be able to cover it and to put it out there, because it's so simple for something as easy as a suitcase to be, that they're moving ballots around, which is a completely normal process, to then become an issue. So that's why it's so important to have an educated media who know about the process, writing about it as well.
The media shapes opinion, which then shapes policy, which shapes and politics, which shapes policy. And you're saying it's important to have educated media.
You're always going to have people who are going to believe that the voting machine is flipping their votes. I mean, you just are. That's been, ever since we got rid of the lever voting machines, that's been the case. But the more the media can be a part of the back end of the process and see how it works, they can sort of help. I mean, just by reporting over and over again the processes, that helps dispel some of the myths and the rumors and the disinformation that gets out there.
Got it.
They do have a very big part of it.
Well, and I'm going to come back to you and kind of your take on this. I also want to bring you and Alex something that I find most interesting, of the many interesting things you write about, is the history of media's role in shaping voting policy in our country, and the interplay that legacy newspapers played in restrictive voting measures since the start of the country. Can you talk a little bit about that, Alex?
Yeah, sure. I think that journalists sometimes we sort of don't realize the influence that we have, and not an influence that is new, an influence that the institution of journalism has always enjoyed in this country. And in this, and you mentioned that we write stories, they influence public opinion, and public opinion influences, every shape of politics, every side of politics in this country. And so when you have a press corps that hasn't done the reading, basically, then that shows up in our coverage. And then that also shows up in how we see the public talking about things like voting rights, about legislation that's related to elections that's being passed. And I think that rooting yourself in history for any reporting project really is always my first step. It's always the first step of every good reporter, is understanding not just what's happening in front of us, but understanding what happened before. And also understanding that those things are not disparate, that the things that we're seeing happen now are dependent upon every single thing that happened before. What other issue is that more true than the fight for voting rights in the US?
Talk about the specific example of the role that I'm forgetting which newspaper in North Carolina, I think the Wilmington paper, played in shaping post-Reconstruction disenfranchisement push.
Yeah, so it was actually the Raleigh News and Observer, but in 1898, there was a white supremacist campaign that happened across the state. It was an election year, and basically the News and Observer and other newspapers in North Carolina as well were used as extremely effective tools to suppress votes of Black residents in Wilmington in particular. At the time, Wilmington had a growing Black middle class. It was the biggest city in North Carolina at the time. It was put to me once that it was sort of on its way to becoming what we see in Atlanta now, like the modern day Atlanta. It was going to be this cosmopolitan place. And there was a multiracial, democratically elected government in Wilmington and indeed across the state. Fusionists, they were called, and these were white and Black politicians who had worked together and got themselves elected. And in the newspaper,
political power.
Right. And so white supremacists at the time said, no, this won't do. And their number one resource for spreading like crazy disinformation was newspapers. And so this was done in the form of inflammatory headlines, stories that were just straight up lies, things that were just made up of the typical tropes of the time, and also powerful political cartoons. A historian once told me that the political cartoons in 1898 were the equivalent of the modern day like cable news. Like these were, and it was an extremely effective way to get a message out. You didn't even have to be literate to get the message.
Inflammatory messaging, raising,
right.
dog whistles.
Right. And it was highly effective. Candidates dropped out for fear for their lives. There were attempted lynchings of, people who had already been elected. And then on the day of when it was time to vote at the polls, people were armed. And if the newspaper campaign hadn't been enough to scare people away, if the threat of violence wasn't enough, then there were the physical presence of people who had been armed with military grade weapons. And it worked. People were afraid for their families. They were afraid for their lives. They didn't vote. And also they were doing a lot of, they had backup plans. They also were stuffing ballot boxes just in case you had the nerve to show up and try to exercise your right. Then it didn't matter because they were going to stuff the ballot box anyhow. And so this was the power of the newspaper as both as a place that readers in the community trusted and looked to for information about the election, and as a tool of propaganda that was used. And it's had an impact that has lasted for generations. There was a coup. People were chased out of town. People were killed. Buildings were burned. And then years later,
the political reins were forcefully removed and handed over to white supremacists. Right.
And a new mayor was installed. Everybody was replaced, essentially. The consequences of that have, lasted for generations after that. The number of, at the time, Black men who were eligible to vote, the number of folks who were registered went down dramatically in the decades after that. And the consequences reverberated through the decades. For that story that I wrote recently, I spoke with William Barber, and he was telling me that when it was time to pass the Voting Rights Act, that Wilmington and several other counties in that area of North Carolina were not considered to be covered underneath that legislation because there was not, quote, sufficient evidence that there had been suppression there, that there had been a history of voting suppression there. And this was, and part of the reason for that is because of the newspaper coverage that did not exist, because there wasn't good reporting about what had happened at the time of the white supremacist campaign and in the years later. There was no record of it. And so the county that includes Wilmington and several other counties in that part of North Carolina, they said, well, we don't have any evidence that anything happened. And so, sorry.
Alex, that is so powerful. And talk about the first draft of history and why newspapers matter. Can you take us to today? How has the press changed and how has it not changed, Alex, when it comes to participating in good or bad, the construction of voting policy?
Everything has changed in some ways, and in other ways, nothing has changed. I think probably the biggest thing that we see today is the absence of a dedicated press corps that reports exclusively on elections. We are really good as an industry, as a press corps at reporting on campaigns. We're character driven. And so we know how to report on politicians as characters when when they're running and after they get into office. But the mechanics of an election remains basically a mystery to most people. Mindy, you mentioned earlier that we see this sort of uptick during election years or leading into election years where there are lots of reporters who are perhaps reassigned to cover this beat. And then November rolls around, everybody casts their vote. we figure out who won, and then everybody kind of goes back to their regular beat. And so elections hasn't been treated as a full-time beat. It's been treated as like a seasonal thing. I think that's one of the biggest problems, because there's no opportunity for reporters to really understand like what is even happening in like a county elections office in a non-election year. Everything that they're doing still matters for when it is election year, but we just have the reporters aren't there, so they don't know. And so the readers don't know. And so then when it is election year and things are coming up and there are questions about security, when there are questions about suppression, there's no foundation. It's like we're starting from scratch every single time.
Can you talk, Alex, about was there a halcyon era where there were full-time elections reporters? Actually, either one of you may know the answer to that question.
I mean, even right now, there's some amazing reporters out there, like Pam Fessler at NPR and Martin East at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but that's not all they write about. That's the thing. It's like Pam Fessler also covers poverty for NPR, not just elections. So that's, like Alex was saying, that's the problem. And then truthfully, like right now, although there's tons of legislation, things would be a little bit, you wouldn't get somebody getting a story necessarily every week, except when maybe the legislatures are in session. So they do, they do have to cover other things, but yeah, I mean, that is the hard part, because there are some really good, hardworking elections journalists out there, but they do cover other things because that's just not the nature of the beast anymore, that they could focus solely on that, because it's not, like Alex said, it's not campaigns, and no one cares what the county clerk is doing right now, even though they're doing a ton of stuff. They're so getting ready for 2022 already. I mean, I do think that the lack of coverage throughout the off years was part of the problem with the whole ballot counting. This past session, California will count ballots forever, and no one thinks twice about that.
So define the problem. The problem with ballot.
The problem was this expectation that the results weren't known, and why did it take so long to count ballots? But no one took any longer than what they really did. But that's just not something, that's not something that people pay too much attention to after the fact, because it's a given. It's often, not always, but it's often a given as to who won on election night. And so people just assume that the ballots are no longer counted. But, like I said, California counts ballots for a month after the election. And that's just because reporters don't tend to cover that. That news isn't out there. And then people don't understand why they were still counting ballots, and
right.
What's wrong with this? Nothing was wrong with it. That's the process.
Right. Even even as news has contracted a lot, there's still some institutional knowledge, a lot of institutional knowledge about politics generally, but so much less about the mechanics of how our democracy stands. Alex, what are the broad trends that have led us to a place where a reporter who's the greatest on this beat even is also covering poverty? So just no big deal covering the collapse of our democracy, and also covering crushing poverty at a time of significant strain. What are the forces that led us to this moment, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is the failure of the business model. And so we've seen cuts in newsroom that have been happening, for well over a decade now, severe cuts, and it's, layoffs and, entire areas of focus, entire beats that just disappear because there are no reporters there to cover it anymore. And this has been especially acute at the local level. And local reporters are the ones who are sort of best positioned to build relationships with state level or county or city level elections workers, such that they do understand, the mechanics of how things happen and can recognize when things are not working, and then that is then reflected in their coverage. So part of the problem is sort of the same problem that every beat has been experiencing, which is we don't have enough journalists who have enough time to do this work. The other thing I'll say is we have this long history, this long tendency of sort of reporting on politics and especially reporting on elections and the campaigns that lead into them, sort of like their sports. And this is what I meant earlier when I said, you know, we are very character driven. And so we fixate on, you know, on a politician or a character or somebody, sort of to the detriment of everything else. And I think that has
off season and on season.
Right.
What's happening in the off season.
Right. Which, and, you know, and actually to kind of poke a hole in my own metaphor, even in sports, there's still lots of reporting that's happening in the off season. You know, sports writers are at training camp and they're looking at everything that's happening before you get to opening day, and before you start the game. And I think with our reporting on politics generally, but especially with elections, we don't do that as well in the off season. And part of the reason that we can't is because, you know, reporters are so deluged with other stuff that has to be covered. And then the last point I'll make is I think that I think that this is starting to change. But I think that we are so used to sort of siloing ourselves away into our respective beats, which is something that has to happen in a news organization so that you can make the newspaper, make the magazine, make the TV show. But
like one thing they're covering only and not covering anything else. Mm-hmm.
Right. But if we sort of stretch that, if we build like a more expansive view of the subject areas that we cover and start to view them as like fundamentally interconnected with what the reporter down the hall is working on, then I think that we can start to compensate in some way for some of these gaps that do exist. So if you're a reporter who is going to cover an election or a candidate, and then you also have to cover poverty, well, a politician's job is to correct for poverty, is to fix it and eliminate it. And so those things are related, and they complement each other, they depend on each other. And I think that if we kind of shift our framework or our point of view towards that, then that can sort of help. And I think that what we've seen, over the last like 5 years of political life in the U.S. is an attempt to kind of shift towards something that looks more like that.
Interesting. I'm very compelled by the sports metaphor and what it does and doesn't do for us here, especially the idea that if we were to take the mechanics and machinery of our democracy as seriously as we take sports, we might have some more off-season coverage in these areas, and it might also check in with other areas and look at the consequences, as you're saying, across lines and not so narrowly look at it. Mindy, what kind of coverage do you see in the off-season, and what is needed?
So like right now, again, it's legislation. I mean, because this is what everybody's doing all this year. It's a lot of when you get away from that, the smaller picture stuff, which is what's happening at county offices. There's a lot of movement in employment this year, and that's because elections officials had a bad year last year, not in how they functioned because they pulled off a great election with no issues. It's that they were threatened. And so there's a lot of movement and personnel issues this year as well. So that happens. And then also just, in normal years, it's they train, they prep, they review what worked and what didn't work in the past year's election, and then they get ready and do it all over again. And, there's
spring training is also needs to be covered, whether it's baseball or elections. Guys, you're awesome. I learned so much from both of you tonight and ongoing. Thank you for being here. I'm going to introduce our next panelists, but we'll also share some of your work with our attendees when we say goodbye. So thank you so much, Alex and Mindy. And now let me introduce panel 2 for tonight. We are so grateful to have 3 of the members of our Votebeat team here. I'll start by introducing Judan Marshall. Judan is one of the first people we spoke to in testing out the need for a Votebeat pop-up. She's the Chief Content Officer and Executive Vice President at WFAE, which is an NPR public radio station serving the Charlotte region. She has held executive roles at the Washington Post Everyday Health and the Center for Cooperative Media. And she's currently launching Story Mosaic, a collaborative reporting platform to help communities partner with local newsrooms to shape reporting. Thanks so much for being here, Judon.
Thanks for having me.
And next, I'm going to introduce Madeline Halpert. Hi, Madeline. Madeline is a freelance journalist who reported on the 2020 election as part of a partnership between Votebeat and the nonprofit news outlet Bridge, Michigan. After the election, she spent months debunking rampant misinformation about fraud in Michigan and exploring political extremism and redistricting efforts in the state. It's great to have you here. And finally, we're lucky to have Jeff Pillets. Jeff has been a reporter for more than 25 years, working for outlets such as Votebeat, The Bergen Record, WNYC in New York, and ProPublica. In 2008, he was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for revealing financial abuses that led to the collapse of a $1 billion taxpayer finance project in the New Jersey Meadowlands. And that's exactly the kind of chops that we are happy to bring to the elections story. So great to have all three of you here. And I'm going to start with you, Judon. As I said, you were one of the first people we talked to when we started exploring this project. And already before Votebeat launched at WFAE, your station was having the Mecklenburg County Director of Elections on air every week last fall. And yet when we came to you and said, do you need more? You said yes. Can you explain why?
Well, I think Mindy and Alex set this up perfectly for us, right? Because there is definitely a horse racing nature to covering local elections and politics. And so the candidates are out there, they're making the headlines themselves. And so you have to respond and react to that and help the audience know what's going on there. But we definitely, so going back, taking a step back for a second, in June of last year, we did a survey to our audience to say, what can we tell you about local elections? What is it that you need to understand? And what that survey revealed was that people had very basic needs, right? Some things that we all take for granted: how to vote, who does what, what's this office responsible for, how the voting process was going to work in a COVID year, how things worked normally. And so we recognized very early on that we have to do a lot of ground level education for the voters in order for them to get them to the issues and then to the polls. And then North Carolina is highly contentious. So when we saw your little beacon that there was possibly some hope on the horizon for help, we jumped on that because we knew we have one political reporter who does politics and government, and that he would be just drowning in the regular coverage. And so we also knew we wanted to do voters guides. And so the Votebeat resources allowed us to cover the mechanics of how to vote and all of the challenges and what those challenges meant for people. And you could see as those stories were coming out, there was a lot of confusion about, do I need an ID? Do I not need an ID? Should I vote twice, right? Which somebody injected into this conversation. And so it was really helpful to just clear a lot of brush for people in understanding.
And thank you for painting that picture and taking us all back to that time. What we did with Votebeat is we had a series of events, exploratory events, just like this one, in the evenings, on the weekends, because we felt compelled. There's got to be something more we could do as a local news organization. We asked donors to come with us. In 6 weeks, we were able to raise the resources to create full-time reporting positions in newsrooms like WFAE to focus on election administration and voting, and not just the horse race, not just the voters guides, but also the mechanics of how can people vote. So Judon, can you talk a little bit about that, the stories that resulted from that? And one of my particular favorites of this whole project was the story that you guys wrote, helping people understand what does happen if you were to vote twice.
Yeah, so I think the disinformation part of this was especially important. More so, always important, but more so this year than any other year, right? Because there were lots of stories about votes being found in ditches on the side of the road and all the ways in which, people were being disenfranchised or voting and abusing their voting power. So a lot of the stories we did was to chase those myths and explain what actually happens. So going into the county election board meeting and that process and talking about how they certify the votes, how they make sure that every person who showed up to vote, that those votes are counted. And we paint the picture of this one story where they're going through this counting and at the end of the night, 10 votes are missing, and that they would not leave the room until those votes were found, right? And eventually they found the votes in an envelope that just got stuck somewhere and, and they were able to find those. But I think it was very important to demystify these processes for people. We had another issue where a person had voted twice. And so we looked at, well, how did that happen? What led to that? Was there any malfeasance? Was this, just an error in judgment or an error in process? And again, walk people through from start to finish what happened and how the system was strong enough to catch that, right? So that second vote didn't get through. There were other things, whether it was, we had people who were accused of being really aggressive at the polls, right? There was a lot of fear that we were seeing on social media, that we were just hearing, out in the community, that people were afraid of intimidation going to the polls this year. And so when people were accused, right, we chased down one story where somebody went in to make an appeal because he was handing out flyers. He was accused of being too aggressive, right? So what did that look like? What was his hearing like? What was the final decision? And again, more than anything, I thought it was really important for us to open that process up to people and to create the transparency. Even down, we had a lot of legal challenges in the state, right? So explaining why those legal challenges existed and what the end results were, I think was really meaningful to people.
And it's so striking to me that to think about the counterfactual of if you hadn't been able to have a reporter in the room watching the proceedings, then there is no record of it.
Right. Right. I think that's exactly right. And so I think when people in our local area, and so, Charlotte is unique in that the region is really interconnected. We were talking about this in my newsroom early today, right? That people in South Carolina work in Charlotte and vice versa. The counties and towns that all have their elections bodies, are very close, but sometimes the rules are slightly different. So you could be hearing information that would be accurate for your neighbor or your coworker and not necessarily accurate for you. And so it was important, again, we not only brought in the Mecklenburg County Elections Director, but we went to the surrounding counties and towns and brought in their elections workers and directors too, to talk directly to the audience about what they were finding.
And, I thought about while you guys were doing that reporting and I was reading along, not living in North Carolina, but even just as a consumer of the national story, there's such an enormous difference between reading a story that says, don't worry, everything's fine. We've talked to all the elections administrators and they say there's no fraud, versus reading your story that says, here's exactly how it works to ensure that people don't vote twice. Here's exactly what happened when a guy did vote twice and how the system caught him. I mean, that just created a totally different level, for me at least, of trust. And it makes me understand why, in the research, it does come up, local news is more trusted. It's more real. It's more concrete.
The other thing we did is we looked at this election year and the irregularities that cropped up this year, and we compared it to previous years, right? Previous election cycles, again, to show people that there's some sort of percentage of irregularity that happens in every election, that there was nothing more nefarious happening this year than any other year. And that, again, that the systems were in place to catch those things.
Awesome. And thank you for the work that you did and are continuing to do. I want to bring Madeline in here from covering the election in Michigan, another extremely contested place, a place where misinformation was also flying and there was a lot of heat. Can you talk about this bigger idea of what was it like for you as the reporter covering this story in Michigan as misinformation is flying? What was that like?
Yeah, well, I mean, to some extent, we expected it, right? I mean, weeks before the election, we had former President Donald Trump talking about how there was going to be fraud in mail-in voting. So we kind of expected a level of misinformation, but I think what we saw in the days after the election and the weeks after the election are really unprecedented, like nothing we've ever seen. I had never reported on elections before, so it was a unique experience for me too. But I think what we at Bridge and with Votebeat, we felt a responsibility to make sure that we were really covering all of these false allegations of fraud, to make sure that we were, informing the public about what was true and what wasn't true. And it was hard to keep up with. I mean, it was really quite rampant. So we did our best. And in the end, what we did is I wrote an article with a couple of my coworkers about 13 lies about election fraud, where we sort of compiled the most, pervasive election fraud claims. And that way we could have one place, and our readers could have one place they could go to kind of look at, here's the truth of what happened in this election. And that way, when the same claim kept coming up, because they frequently did, whether it be in a lawsuit or, coming from a Republican poll challenger, that way they had one place to go to and sort of look and, realize what the truth of the election was. And I remember I had a county clerk who told me that he had that article bookmarked on his bookmarks bar so that he could come back to it when a voter called to ask about a claim of election fraud. He could just, have the list to look at.
I heard that story too from our colleagues through you that happened. And that's another kind of one of those counterfactuals where it's like, wait, isn't that the election administrator's job to help people understand that there isn't fraud? Why do journalists have to come in and do that? But I guess they were pretty busy.
They were really busy. And, I think they really did do their best, and they were answering phone calls and, answering information about fraud, but they needed some help. And I think the media also played an important role in them educating the public. I mean, the clerks took a lot of time to speak to us to make sure that we understood the process so that we could then convey that information to the public. So the media plays a really important role there.
And can you give just an example of the granularity of claims that were floating around and how you investigated them?
Yeah, so I think a lot of claims came up about Detroit. That's where a lot of Republican poll challengers focused their energy. They sent, hundreds of poll challengers to the TCF Center in Detroit, which is where they were counting the absentee ballots. So, in the days and weeks following the election, there were a lot of claims about fraud in Detroit. For example, several poll challengers claimed they saw a man bring in harvested ballots on a wagon. Turns out that was actually just the cameraman's equipment. So it was things like that. It was really just basic misunderstandings that they then continued to perpetuate. So I spent a lot of time talking on the phone to poll challengers and then also to elections officials, one of the head elections officials in Detroit, to kind of combat these allegations. And there were some allegations which weren't necessarily fraud, but areas of improvement. For example, there wasn't, an equal amount of Republican election workers and Democratic election workers, which is a challenge in a predominantly Democratic city. And election officials were honest about that, but that was one of the kind of claims that Republican poll challengers were using as evidence of fraud.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, I hope everyone will go back and check out some of your work. And you're also, I know, in the conclusion of your work, you started looking ahead at some of the stories that continue to go forward in Michigan. So I'm going to come back to you on that, Madeline. Jeff, you reported for Votebeat from New Jersey. Michigan and North Carolina, obvious choices for where to have Votebeat reporters. New Jersey, a little bit less obvious. However, we ended up having a major impact in New Jersey too with our reporting. Can you talk a little bit about some of the impacts that some of the stories you wrote, and then the changes that we've seen as a result of them?
Well, the thing we found in New Jersey was that the problem that we faced was kind of the burden of our own past, in that we didn't have any. We're a progressive state, but we didn't have any progressive voting measures. We didn't have early voting. We didn't have mail-in voting. So everything they had to invent right as it was happening, and most of the problems and the confusion that we had were generated from the expectation of the voters. they wanted to vote with their lever machines, which is basically what they've done for the last 30 years, maybe even more. And yes, the lever machines, and we don't, Mindy was talking about the old time lever machines. We still have them. And I think that was for me the biggest surprise in New Jersey, that even though we're a progressive state and we're supposed to be advanced and liberal and we spend a lot of money, we're very backwards, and that the administrative side of it is pretty much in a silo, and it wasn't listening to the county clerks and to the election boards. So what we did is that we spent a lot, since we didn't have a lot of.
Say it wasn't listening. What do you mean?
Well, the state pretty much just order the election and put the details on the county, on the clerks and on the election boards. So they had to invent this going forward. They did not have, there was no precedent. They never ran a statewide mail-in election, or they never ran early voting. They had absentee voting, but that was minuscule. All of a sudden, everything was mail-in voting. So that became, so what we decided to do, since we didn't have a lot of, there weren't allegations of fraud, widespread allegations of fraud. There were some, but it wasn't the problem like it was in North Carolina and Georgia, or the alleged problem that it was there. So we just started to call around to the local officials. We got to know the county clerks. We talked to the boards of election, and we sort of dove into what they did. And I have to say, I was embarrassed, having been a reporter for 20 years or so, not to know that, because as we've said before here, that we basically cover politics. We cover the horse race. We cover we cover it like an athletic event, a contest, and right. No reporters really focused on the voting administration part of it.
And then so when you did focus on that and you found that, oh my gosh, the state that thinks it's so far ahead is actually quite behind in terms of the technology of both voting machines, and your coverage showed of voter registration systems. What kind of stories did you write, and what is the consequences we're seeing now?
We wrote a lot of stories about the technology, the technological side of it. We wrote some stories about the contract that the state had with the vendors that actually monitor, that actually take care of the state voter registration system. The local officials on the ground were telling us that they couldn't get accurate information, so they didn't know where to mail out people's votes. They didn't know how to correspond individuals to congressional districts, because the state computers were so bad, were so out of date, so to speak, that they were sending up they got all sort of bad information. They were sending them to the wrong addresses. They were getting a lot of stuff back in the mail. So we did a lot on voter technology. We did a story that resonated a lot about the company that monitors, that maintains the state voting registration system. And it turns out that we had a ton of impact. I want
to pause before you get to that and just say, it kind of takes me back to what Judon was talking about. Like, these are incredibly unsexy stories in many ways, like the contracts, the vendors, how does the technology work? What is the voter registration system? But this is the machinery, all of these decisions in a room of someone counting, and where do those 10 votes go, or developing a voter registration system. That is, as you say, Jeff, how people end up having large participation in voting or not. It does come down to these kind of.
They were unsexy stories, but not this year, because
they had such a big impact.
They had big impact, and the people had the sense that the democracy was sort of on the line. That it's different this year.
Oh yeah. And I want to say, all three of you made, all three newsrooms represented here made the unsexy, so what some might call unsexy topics really engaging and interesting, and got a lot of people to read.
People thought their votes weren't going to count. People thought that their votes were not going to be secret, which was new to me. How could they not be secret just because it's a mail-in vote? So we did a lot of those types of stories to explain that. People worried about their votes. We had a track your vote function on the state website, and it didn't work. So we spent a lot of time explaining to people what was wrong with that. In the end, a lot of the advocates of the people who are trying to increase voting rights, and the people who have been in these trenches for years, they started to recognize our stories and they started a call, and the whole thing sort of snowballed. And by the end, we sort of became a clearinghouse for the different advocates and for different, even professors. There was a Princeton University professor who was an expert on voting machines and voting fraud through voting machines. And we were putting him in touch with counties who were buying new voting machines in New Jersey, and we were bringing together advocates who normally didn't talk to each other like they should have. So we were having conference calls. I met a couple of times with the state to talk about some of our findings. So the refreshing thing for me was that we had that sort of, the Votebeat gave us this forum to do that in this incredibly unsexy realm of voting administration, which no reporter really covers that much. But it gave us, it turns out there were tons of sexy stories there because this year it really mattered.
Yes, and I think my lightning round question to close out this incredible panel is to ask each of you for the one most important story you think we need to be paying attention to in your state going forward. Because if I've learned anything in this project, it's that the story is far from over. I know legislative activity continues obviously all around the country and in all these 3 states that will determine how open voting is and who ends up voting. So Jeff, we'll start with you and Madeline, and then we'll close with Judon.
We have 16 counties in New Jersey, and 15 of them are using old-fashioned lever machines. There's only one county that has a voter-verified paper machine, of voter-verified paper ballots that you could audit correctly. In the next 2 or 3 years, all those are going to be replaced, yet the state has no role in guiding. They've not taken any leadership role in guiding the local officials about what to do, what to look for, how much money they should spend, how they should work together. That's, in my opinion, that's going to be the most important thing in the next year or so in New Jersey.
Thanks. And I know that's happening all across the country in different ways, especially with the federal push to get our voting technology modernized. Thank you, Jeff. Madeline, Michigan.
Yeah, I think, voting rights legislation, I mean, we've seen that across the country, that we're seeing, legislation being introduced to, an attack on voting rights. And I think we need to pay attention to that in Michigan, where misinformation about the election still circulates, misinformation in general. We recently had top Republican in the legislature claim that what happened on January 6th, the insurrection, was a hoax. Until, last February, they were still holding hearings, of an investigation and inquiry into the election. This is the same committee that heard testimony from Rudy Giuliani that ended up being parodied on SNL. So the misinformation about fraud continues to circulate. And so it will be interesting to see what kind of legislation will be, the Republican-led legislature will try to pass to, influence that in the future.
That's awesome. Thank you, Madeline. Judon, we'll end with you.
So my assistant news director has been raising the alarm on redistricting in North Carolina, right? It's a story we've already covered extensively, but this battle is heating up. I mean, the Brennan Center put us on the list of states to watch because of the redistricting battle here. Over the last 30 years, there have been more than 50 lawsuits, I believe, around how we draw our maps here. And so, we were temporarily approved for maps for this election, but they're going to be redrawn. So that's something we have to watch closely. I mean, we have college campuses that are split down the middle into different districts, right, as part of the way we draw maps here. So that's going to be a huge story for us.
Well, thank you guys for painting a picture of both of what we were able to accomplish together. And it was just a privilege to work with all of you, truly. And it's so great to have you here tonight. Thank you. And what we need to do next, which is a great segue for me to make some final requests of our community watching. So bye, guys. Thank you for being here. I want to end by saying that I hope tonight's presentation helps you understand why I've become so determined that just as I felt in September of 2020, when we made a 6-week sprint to ensure that the Votebeat project could get up and running, we need to do that again to extend this project's coverage through the 2022 midterms. The story goes on, it goes on all across the country, and more focused local reporters are needed to cover it. period. To ensure that we can continue to do that, to cover misinformation, to give information, to counter misinformation, to cover redistricting battles like Judan was mentioning, to cover the monumental efforts to upgrade our local election administration to ensure that they're modernized and everyone can vote. We need your help again. We have to meet a fundraising goal of $3 million by April 30th. That's a first goal, and another $3 million by June 30th to keep this project going through the 2022 midterms. Really, it's that simple. We raise the money and we can do this, or we don't and we can't. And we're living in that counterfactual world we spoke about. I feel so strongly that if Votebeat can't go forward, we will lose an opportunity to hold our local and national officials accountable to make sure that every single person does vote in this country, does have the chance to vote in this country. I invite all of you who feel the same way, that same level of urgency about what is needed, please be part of this effort, continue to be a part of this effort. If you already were the first time, spread the word, send a donation, give a call and talk about how you can help. We will send out information in a follow-up email about how to get involved. You can reach out to me and you can reach out to our Senior Development Director, Kimberly Spencer, who can answer any questions. Thank you so much again to our incredible panelists. We are so grateful to have you guys here tonight to help us explain the importance of this story, and for all of the work you do to educate citizens too. And thank you to our audience. I know that you guys are the ones who are going to help us get to the brighter side of this dark time. And it's really been a pleasure to work with all of you. Thank you.